Wait. Now, yes. So, I don't know if you all can listen to us and see and watch us at the same time. I don't know. Good evening, everyone. I just would like to know if anyone can confirm that now you can watch and listen to us. Just say hi. Yes, I have the, yeah. So, it's working. Sound okay, video okay. So, off we start. First, good evening, everyone. So, first I must say, I'm so sorry because we had some technical problems due to the Microsoft Teams, which actually it's not the kind of app I prefer, but if it is the only way possible to make these kind of talks happening, then let's go for Microsoft Teams and we can turn all the problems and hurdles that Microsoft Teams poses and gives to us. So, first place, ladies and gentlemen, good evening once again for everyone joining us presently in Portugal. And also good afternoon for those that are following us on my YouTube channel from the Americas. My today's guest is a veteran Serbian journalist with over 25 years of experience. He's also a documentary filmmaker, being the author of Brothers in Arms, a film that presents the role of the European Union as well as NATO in the creation of conflicts, and also concerning interference or interventionism, which actually goes along with the same subject or the same topic that I've been developing my academic research for more or less a decade, like everyone knows about, at least those who follow me on a regular basis. At the same time, this documentary, Brothers in Arms, also focus on the similarity between Croatian and Ukrainian fascism and their hatred for orthodoxy. He has been to the Donbass many times. Actually, presently, he joins us today from there, from the Donbass, from Donetsk, and he has been an important voice to let us know more about the events on the ground. Most of these events not mentioned on mainstream media. It's a huge pleasure for me to have him with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Miodrag Zarkovic. Dear Miograd, on first place, let me thank you for accepting to join us today. As you know, a significant part of my audience belongs to Portuguese-speaking communities like Portugal, Brazil, Angola, Mozambique. And usually, I always like to make this question to all my foreign guests, which is like, let me ask you if, is this the first time you visit Portugal, so to speak? Oh my God. Wait, no, sorry to interrupt you, but people are saying that they can't listen to you. Oh my goodness. They ca Yeah, I can, but they can't. Let me see how can we figure this out. What could be the problem with this? Guys, not easy to do this tonight, but I'm pretty sure will be able to do it. Let me see, what could the problem be? So, because I can listen to you, but I can hear you, but they can't hear you. Mic is muted. No, it isn't muted, guys, but there has to be some kind of problem here. This
Unmute
way.
my mic.
Can
hear me
can
now?
they listen to you now?
Yeah, I'll talk something. Can they hear me now? Can they hear me now?
Is it
I'm
possible?
talking.
Waiting for their answer. Can you hear
And I don't have a
Miodrag
problem
now?
with talking
It's okay
as long
now.
as
It's okay.
now.
Yes.
So it was
Oh,
about your headphones, huh?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's go.
So, just to repeat, thanks for the invitation. Yes, this is the first time I am in Portugal. And as I said, just one small correction. I thoroughly enjoyed Alexander's introduction, even though I'm not really sure I deserve it. But just to correct something, I was never part of Dire Straits. Brothers in Arms is the title of their album and song. My movie was titled Brothers by Enemy. So yeah, thanks for the invitation.
I'm kind of a fan of Dire Straits, and I'm really sorry for this kind
No,
of
I
mess.
mean, I'm not offended. I guess maybe they wouldn't be offended, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's a common mistake. They usually confuse me with Mark Knopfler, you know. So it's not a problem. Yeah.
So yes, and actually he has been quite presently, not quite actively speaking, because I'm not going to make confuse Mark Knopfler and at the same time Pink Floyd, any kind of Pink Floyd member. So I want to put that aside. But you are from a country that was in the spotlight for the worst reasons on late 20th century. Many people still cannot understand what happened in and at the same time to Yugoslavia since 1990. In fact, although Yugoslavia was not a part of the Soviet Union, it seems somehow that the country was also affected by the latter's dissolution. What do you think about that?
I mean, I can only feel sympathy for the people who are confused because it's really a totally confusing subject. First of all, the Yugoslavia that was bombed in '99 was not really the Yugoslavia that existed prior to '91. Yugoslavia that existed prior to '91 is the more famous, let's say, Yugoslavia, the bigger one. But even that was not the first Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, or as it was called at first, Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, was established right after World War One. There are numerous interpretations of that decision, of that move, but one that's really, let's say, sounds realistic to me is that the West, mainly Brits, didn't want actually Serbs to have an strong independent state that Serbs probably deserved after World War One, because we were by far the heaviest victims of that war. And I mean, people maybe don't know, but by some accounts, more than half of male population of Serbia was destroyed in World War One. We were the country that has how to say that, it's not an honor, but dishonor or whatever. It's not even dishonor. It's not our dishonor, but we were the country that was first victim or first target of biological weapon, modern biological weapon, by Austro-Hungarians. And so on and so on. So I mean, we had it really tragically in World War One, and because of that, we deserved what we had even before the war, but on a much bigger territory, as one of the countries that emerged victorious from the war. In order to prevent that Serbs, traditional allies of Russians, have some sort of huge influential state in the Balkans, Brits or their agents or their agents of influence came up with the idea of joint state between Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. And to tell you the truth, many among Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes at the time did support the idea. I mean, the very idea is probably originated in the area even long before World War One. That country was renamed, I think in 1929, into Yugoslavia. So it was first called Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. It was utterly confusing name, too long a name. So perhaps the only time in history something was made simpler by changing the name to Yugoslavia, but it's effectively the same country. Yugoslavia suffered another horrific fate in World War II, especially Serbs, who were victims of genocide. I mean, for some reason, official history, if there is such thing as an official history, isn't recognizing that as a genocide, even though it's not a bit less horrific than what happened to Jews at the same time, or what happened to Armenians in World War One. In the World War One, Serbs on the eastern part of the Drina River suffered horrific fate. Now in World War II, Serbs on the west of Drina River suffered a genocide committed by Ustaše regime in independent state of Croatia. Independent state of Croatia was a puppet state created by, supported by Nazis and created by Croatian Nazis called Ustaše. Yugoslavia itself was conquered in a matter of days by Germany in 1941. It wasn't supposed to go like that. The Yugoslav leadership even signed a sort of a treaty with Axis power in the March of 1941. But then Serbs, who, have a bitter historical memory of Germans, actually took the streets of Belgrade, which was capital at the time, and in huge protests practically overthrown the government that signed that deal and canceled the deal with Germans. Hitler was furious because of that, and in a matter of days he launched a huge offensive on Yugoslavia. In that offensive, of course, Serbia, Belgrade, and the rest of the Serbia were heavily bombed. We were not a match for Germans, which were practically the best military in the world at the time, and already in preparation for the invasion of Soviet Union. So we were just a small potatoes for them, sadly, and we were conquered in a matter of days, and Yugoslavia was divided. One of the biggest pieces of Yugoslavia became independent state of Croatia, which was a Croatian state run by Croatian Nazis and supported by Nazi Germany and Italy. And so in both world wars, Serbs suffered horrific fate. And after the World War II, even though there were two, I mean, I hope I'm not boring you or your viewers, but this may sound interesting.
They are enjoying it presently, actually.
Because this, what I'm about to tell, he served as an inspiration for George Orwell and his possibly most famous idea implanted in his famous novel 1984. There were at least two rebel movements in Serb parts of the conquered Yugoslavia, not only in Serbia but also Serbian territories that fell into independent state of Croatia. So there were at least two, I say at least two movements because it's not really clear how many movements were involved in one larger movement that we can call Royalists. Royalists were led by General Dragoslav Mihailović, who was an ally of Allied forces in the war. He even saved a lot of American and British pilots when they would be shut down over the territory that he covered. There is a movie, I think, right now that is filmed about that. So anyway, he was the first anti-Nazi guerrilla movement, I think, in the entire Europe. His rebellion started in May of 1941. I think that at that time, literally not a single military force fought Hitler. So Dragoslav Mihailović and his rebels were the first to stand up to Hitler in the conquered Europe. After Soviet Union was invaded in June, Josip Broz partisans also, they were the communists. They also rose in arms against Hitler, against the occupiers. So we had at least two movements, and of course, why not make it all the more complicating? Those two movements not only fought Hitler, but they also fought each other. That was mainly ideological division, but this is Balkans, so any division can easily turn into a mortal one. So yeah, they fought between themselves heavily. I do lean toward one of those movements, but nevertheless, it is true that both of those movements on the basic level were consisted of people who only wanted to liberate their country. Now, at the beginning of the war, until 1943, allies, and especially Britain, was supporting Dragoslav Mihailovich because he was loyal to the government in exile, to the king in exile, which was actually in exile in London, in Great Britain. And they even made a movie about Dragoslav Mihailovich and his troops. I think it's called Chetniks or whatever. And for example, American media, American magazines were writing very favorably about Dragoslav Mikhailovich's troops, about their bravery, about how how hard they fight against Germany's Nazis and whatnot. But then in 1943, there was a change of heart in London. And for whatever reason, Winston Churchill's government decided to support Dragoslav Mikhailovich no more, but to switch their support towards Josip Broz and his partisans. That is one of the facts that will determine everything that's happening in the Balkans until now. But what is most important for the story about George Orwell? George Orwell was working at the Ministry of Information at the time. He famously wanted to be a volunteer on the trenches, on the front line, but he was denied because of some health problems. So he then joined the Ministry of Information. And he was ordered, along with other members of the Ministry of Information, to erase any trace whatsoever, any document whatsoever that would reveal that Britain ever supported Dragoslav Mikhailovich. It was like as if literally that was his inspiration for the 1984. You know, when the country that's I don't remember. It's called Oceania, right? No, what's the country that's super country that is 1984 set in?
Yeah, from George Orwell. Yes, I remember the romance, but okay.
They are in war with country number 2 and ally with country number 3, but then suddenly they switch. They are, starting from today, in war with country number 2 and ally with country number 1. And not only did they switch it, but they actually claim that it's always been like that. They have never been in war with country number 1 and ally with country number 2. Orwell found the inspiration for that in the case of Dragoslav Mikhailovich. He famously wrote, I think that those writings of his were kept a secret until 15 or 20 years ago. He wrote, Britain as an empire has the right to pursue its own interests, has the right to change its interests, has the right to pick allies or enemies according to its interest, has the right to change sides or to change allies, but it doesn't have the right to change history. It doesn't have the right to lie that it was always as it is now. So for one reason or another, Winston Churchill made an agreement with Josip Broz. Chances are that Joseph Stalin, the leader of Soviet Union, didn't know about that agreement. He wasn't particularly fond of Broz, even though both were namely communists. But there are hints that he even wanted to remove Broz from the leading position of the Yugoslav Communist Party before the war. So the two of them weren't on good terms, and because of that, Stalin possibly didn't know everything Broz was doing or wasn't familiar with all the Broz moves. So when Stalin met with Churchill it was in 1945, I believe, when they were practically dividing Europe, they agreed that the Eastern Europe will come under Soviet rule. The Western Europe will be under American, British, or French rule, or whatever, and Yugoslavia will be neutral. Stalin possibly agreed to that because he had no idea that Broz was already supported by Winston Churchill by official London. He soon found out. Even though there is confusion in the last days of the war and first day of the peace, while there was a transition from the war situation into a peaceful situation, from monarchy into a republic, from a functioning democracy to a one-party dictatorship. And in that confusion, Broz was actually pretty skilled in switching alliance and then going back to the old alliances. So there are reports about, which I'm not 100% familiar with, about even some clashes between American and Soviet fighters fighter planes over Yugoslavia. So the Third World War easily could start then and there, immediately after the Second World War, could easily start then and there. For some reason, it didn't. By 1948, Stalin realized that Broz is actually an asset of the West, and he cut all ties with him. That's the famous Inform-Bureau resolution. And ever since, Yugoslavia was, a socialist country, but really not a part of the Soviet bloc. In fact, it was often used by the West as sort of a Trojan horse for the Soviet bloc. Josip Broz is, if you ask me, one of the worst dictators and tyrants and criminals of the 20th century, possibly the worst the worst individual ever to rule out of Belgrade. And his dictatorship was bloody. He killed, imprisoned, tortured his political enemies. He banned all the parties but his. He declared himself a leader for life, dictator for life. He literally did whatever he wanted. And then he actually ruled Yugoslavia until he died in 1980. In 1984, America, for some reason, by the way, when I said that Broz was skilled in finding protectors and mentors, he soon realized that Churchill is not going to cut it, so he made deal with Americans. So Yugoslavia actually lived more than decently on American money. There were huge financial there was a huge financial help for Yugoslavia by Americans. I'm not gonna throw numbers because I don't recall them correctly, but I think it can be easily confirmed on the internet. And we lived on those donations, even though there was some industry or some export or whatever, but it was mainly organized and helped by Americans. At one point we even exported cars to the United States, which, of course, barely anyone in the United States even noticed that, but it was a huge for Yugoslavia and for the Yugoslav car industry, even though officially that car was, I think, officially recognized as the worst car ever that was produced.
Even worse than the Trabant?
And I think that those persons, no, it was called Yugo. Yugo. I think that those precious few Americans that actually bought it would probably agree with it, you know. And so our economy was hugely held by Americans until 1984. What made Americans change their mind? change their mind then? I can only guess. But in 1984, Congress or the Senate, I'm really not sure, decided to cut all or most of the financial support for Yugoslavia. I was a kid back then. Of course, we had no idea that first that we were practically living on American money, and number two that the support is going to stop. But I do remember the sudden economic crisis. We had gasoline rations, energy rations, I think even food rations. I mean, I was 10, 11 years old, 12 years old when the crisis reached us. But it was heavy. And it all helped stir emotions, because Croatia was never punished for its crimes in the World War II, the way Germany was, the way Austria was. Croats went totally without punishment, possibly because Tito Broz himself was a Croat, or at least half Croat. Serbs that happened to stay in the borders of Croatia, which was by then one of the 6 republics that created Yugoslavia. Broz and his idea and the rest of his crew, they divided Yugoslavia on 6 republics, from the north to the south: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia. And guess what? Only Serbia was rewarded with 2 autonomous provinces. One was Vojvodina, the other was Kosovo. The official reason for the creation of those 2 provinces was, in those areas, Serbs are actually not the minority. Well, which is strange, because there were large areas of Croatia where Croats were not a majority, not minority, majority. Where Croats were not a majority, or quite the opposite. Serbs were a majority, but those areas never got any autonomy. There were huge areas in Bosnia that were with Serbian majority or Croatian majority, never, not even mention of autonomy. There are Albanians in Macedonia. They populated huge areas as a majority, no autonomy whatsoever, but Serbia was rewarded with 2 autonomies. And the Albanian population in Kosovo, even though back then in 1945, when those republics were formed, Albanian population in Kosovo was really a tiny majority, like it was 52% compared to 48%, something like that. But still, by 1980s, due to Broz government's favorable treatment of Albanian refugees from Albania itself, the demography of Kosovo changed significantly. So by the 1980s, they consisted probably 65 or maybe even 70%, maybe even 75% of the entire population of Kosovo. And in the early 80s, they started making demands. They wanted to become a fully recognized republic, like other 6 republics. They wanted to be a separate republic. Probably because, according to the Yugoslav constitution, republics had the right to separate from the rest of the country, from the federation. Although only if other republics agree. Mm-hmm. They couldn't do it unilaterally, which is important for later on. So anyway, economical crisis, protests of Albanians, recollection of the horrors of the Second World War, or that contributed to the political crisis that culminated in the late 80s and early 90s, when, especially in the 1991, actually in 1990 already, when there were first democratic so-called elections in each of the republics. Now, why in republics and not on a state level? Well, because once again, American authorities played a crucial role in that. In 1990, there was a State Department's, a bill or something, which proposed that no Yugoslav republic who doesn't hold a separate democratic elections, which have to be verified as democratic by the American government. Any country who doesn't hold, any republic who doesn't hold elections like that, won't receive any help by the US in terms of finance and trade. Now, as I said already, as evidenced by the example with the car, with the automobile industry, Yugoslavia's economy was heavily dependent not only on American aid, but also trade favors and whatever. So when America ordered that all the republics have separate elections, that was it. In those separate elections, Franjo Tuđman won, and his party, HDZ, Hrvatska demokratska zajednica, or the Democratic Union of Croats, Croatian Democratic Union, they won elections in Croatia. Franjo Tuđman is famous, or better yet, infamous, by at least one statement of his and one statement of his closest associate, Stipe Mesić. Tuđman infamously said, well, luckily my wife is neither a Jew nor a Serb. I mean, even though in the 1990 when he said that, it wasn't a time like this when you get canceled for anything practically. But even back then, it was really a horrific statement, especially to Serbs who suffered a genocide only a generation later. I mean, people who lived through genocide were still alive. Their relatives who lost their loved ones in the genocide were still alive. You know,
Yeah.
not a single Serbian family from those areas was spared during the genocide. At least in every family, you knew at least one relative who suffered horrifically, who died in a death camps. I mean, just to point how horrific that genocide is. I think that's the only example in history that concentration camps for kids were organized. Independent state of Croatia for almost 2 years ran concentration camps for kids. So I mean, exclusively for children, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, a generation later, someone says, a president of Republic of Croatia actually says, luckily my wife is neither a Serb nor a Jew. Second statement is by his closest associate at the time, Stipe Mesić, who said also infamously that in the World War II, Croatia won twice. First in 1941, second time in 1945. How can you win in 1941? I mean, he was also obviously referring to the independent state of Croatia. That and other incidents, of course, made Serbs in Croatia suspicious, and they started to organize because they really didn't want to allow anything similar to what they suffered in World War II. So it all went so when Croatia declared independence, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence unilaterally, not asking the permission of other republics, and Germany, by that time unified Germany, even though they know very well that it's against the constitution of Yugoslavia, they recognized Slovenia and Croatia, and they used their newly built diplomatic influence, because they were darlings of the entire Europe, because suddenly Europe was fascinated that Germans are united once again. So Germany allowed all that, used all that to force the rest of the Europe into recognizing Slovenia and Croatia as independent states. Americans were largely disinterested in Yugoslav conflict by that point, but they suddenly got extremely interested when the war broke out in Bosnia, which was a central republic of Yugoslavia, and utterly the most confusing one, because you had not two but three conflicting sides: Bosnian Muslims, Serbs, and Croats. Serbs from Bosnia suffered. Bosnia was also part of the independent state of Croatia in World War II. So Serbs from Bosnia had just as many reasons as Serbs from Croatia to fear and to react to pro-Nazi, to historical revisionism, if you want, by new Croat authorities or new Bosnian authorities. So anyway, the war in Bosnia broke out in 1992. Well, that is when Americans saw the opportunity, we can use Bosnian Muslims as allies in order to show to Muslims in the Middle East that we're not actually against Islam itself, in order to improve their relationship with Muslims in the Middle East. Yeah. They wanted to use Bosnian Muslims. It was a great opportunity for them. So they started financing, supporting, whatnot, and using the conflict as a whole to promote the idea of them as protector of Muslims in Europe. And in order to protect Muslims, you must have somebody who is attacking those Muslims, and because of that, to cut the long story short, if it's even possible, because I've been talking for more than half an hour.
Yeah. But people are actually following this because it's quite interesting, all this historical context. It's important if we want to understand.
Thanks, people. Thanks, Alexandra. So that is why propaganda against Serbs was launched and used, because Serbs were needed to be portrayed as utter villains in order for America's protection of Bosnian Muslims to be more effective. And we were portrayed as genocidal imbeciles in articles, in movies, in Hollywood TV shows, you name it. Well until 1995. In 1994 and later on in 1995, Americans even intervened directly, got involved in the Bosnian war directly. Effectively, for example, in 1993, there was an operation conducted by Serbian forces in Bosnia, which would effectively end the war. The operation was so successful that it totally caught Bosnian Muslim troops by surprise. Sarajevo itself, the capital of Bosnia, was practically without possibility to resist Serbian advance. Serbs would, in a matter of days, hold either the Sarajevo completely or the biggest part of Sarajevo. At that point, Americans intervened by pressuring Serbia, which was a separate republic, by pressuring Serbia into pressuring Bosnian Serbs to stop with the offensive. And effectively, they just didn't want to allow Serbs to emerge victorious. I mean, they needed the war to go on, and they obviously didn't want the Serbs to emerge victorious. So they pressured Belgrade, official Belgrade, to pressure Serbs in Bosnia to stop the offensive. And yeah, they did. So everything after every single victim of the Bosnian War after '93 is at least partially on America. Is something that America is guilty for. Anyway, the
Do you
Bosnian
believe
War
that
ended
the extremist Islamists were sent back then to Bosnia in order to increase tensions with Belgrade authorities?
Bin Laden was in Bosnia. That was testified actually in the Hague Tribunal by two journalists. I can recall the name of the British journalist, Eve Ann Prentice. I don't remember the name of the Italian journalist, but two of them were sitting in the hall waiting in front of Ali Izetbegovic office. Ali Izetbegovic was the war president of Bosnia. He was a Bosnian Muslim. He was the leader of the Bosnian Muslims. And they had a scheduled interview with him. And they were waiting in front of his office for him to invite them in. And suddenly the door opened and he walked out of his office with a tall man. They didn't recognize who it was at the time. Actually, back then, Osama bin Laden wasn't a world-known figure. So they saw Ali Izetbegovic and the tall man, hugging and saying farewell, and then Ali Izetbegovic let them in. Years later, when they saw the footage of Osama bin Laden after 9/11, they were like, "Oh, that's the guy we saw with Ali Izetbegovic," And Slobodan Milosevic, who I will explain later on, when he was in The Hague, tried, when there was a trial against him in The Hague, he called Eve Ann Prentice to testify. That's why I remember her name and not of the other journalist. And actually, she testified that, but the judge ruled that not pertinent to the case. Like it has nothing to do with the case, even though Milosevic in The Hague was accused of committing a genocide against Bosnian Muslims. So he wanted to show there was no genocide, A, and B, they were hardly the victims because they were associated with known terrorists, Yeah. And judge was like, no, this testimony is going to be erased, from the official documents. Everybody can check what I'm saying. I mean, I'm not making anything up. All that I'm saying is easily verifiable.
The records, actually, the official records are available through the ICTY.
I did it. Actually, even Prentice's testimony is from her testimony. That part is erased, but she herself, she died later on. But after the testimony, after she gave testimony, she actually talked openly about that. Yeah, they had part of my testimony removed from the official documents, and she confirmed what she said at the court. So anyway, in '95, the war in Bosnia ended. Milosevic, who now coming to the, sorry, I'm just right now remembering why did it start talking all this. So you mentioned Yugoslavia. When the big Yugoslavia fell apart in '91, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, then Bosnia, then eventually Macedonia. The only two republics that remained were Serbia and Montenegro. And in '92, Serbia and Montenegro decided to be not some remaining of the old Yugoslavia, but to create a new federation consisted of only two republics, which will again be called Yugoslavia, only not Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia as the big one, but only to be called Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And that Yugoslavia consisted only of Serbia and Montenegro, was bombed in 1999, so only less than 4 years after the Bosnian War ended. Now, the reason for the bombing is officially that Serbia committed a genocide against Albanians in Kosovo. First of all, until 1998, there was no effective rebellion, armed rebellion against Serbia in Kosovo. There were protests, there were political parties or political movements or social movements that were against Serbia, that were for Kosovo's independence or whatnot. But there actually was no armed rebellion. It only started with the help of American envoy to Balkans, Richard Holbrooke, and his closest associate, Christopher Hill. Christopher Hill is, to my eternal puzzlement, right now he is the US ambassador in Belgrade. He came here a year and a half ago, in January of 21, let's say more or less month before Russian special operation in Ukraine began. I don't think it's a coincidence that America sent as its ambassador to Serbia, which is a known historical ally of Russia, that as its ambassador they sent a well-known anti-Serb figure only a month before the biggest war of our lives was about to begin. So anyway, with the help of Richard Holbrooke and Christopher Hill, and other Americans, diplomats and whatnot, Albanian rebels were armed, organized, and they started organizing terrorist attacks against Serbian police forces, Serbian military forces in the province, even, of course, civilians, not only Serbian civilians, but also Albanian civilians that were loyal to Serbia as a country, or not, maybe not loyal, but not interested in political fight against Serbia. And America first wanted to bomb Serbia in October of 1908, but because America's plans for the bombing were discovered and revealed by our military attaché in Brussels, their plan backfired when they sent, like days before they were about to launch a bombing campaign, they sent drones to see where are the positions of our army, and they saw that our army is nowhere to be seen. You know, that's when they realized that our army was informed about their plans and that our army is now hidden. So they couldn't go on with the bombing campaign in October of 1999. So they reversed to plan B. Let's force Serbia to accept UN mission in Kosovo. EU mission in Kosovo. UN mission. UN mission in Kosovo was headed by William Walker, one of the nastiest warmongers of the decade. He was involved in some bloody business in South or Central America too. I don't want to talk too much because I'm probably going to I'm going to be incorrect about the country or whatever, but I'm totally certain that he had some bloody history there too. But when he came to Kosovo in late 1998, he immediately started with provocations. And the biggest provocation was in January of 1999, when there was, in the village of Račak, I guess that many of your viewers will be familiar with the name. There was a fight between Serb police forces and some Albanian guerrilla fighters, rebellions, terrorists. The operation was undertook during the night, if I'm correct. In any case, what everyone needs to know about that operation, the head of the operation, Guri is his nickname. His actual name I can't remember. Radosavljević, Guri, what's his name? I can't recall. He's a famous police officer, police leader from the 90s. Goran Radosavljević Guri. Yeah, Goran Radosavljević Guri. After the war, after the bombing and everything, he was teaching that same operation to American military schools. He was invited by American military schools to teach American military students about that operation. Now just keep that in mind when I say the following. After the operation ended, which was a huge success for the Serbian police withdrew from the village. They managed to kill or capture everyone they wanted to kill or capture. After that, somebody organized all those dead bodies into a single trench. William Walker was invited. He came, and immediately after he saw the bodies in the trench, he said, "This is the site of a horrific Serbian crime against humanity." Unless he's a Superman or a kryptonite, he has a kryptonite vision, and he doesn't, and he isn't, and he doesn't. How the hell could he know what happened? How the hell could he know? But immediately what he said was translated, broadcast all over the world, and Serbs were instantly accused of committing an act of genocide against Albanians. That's how the preparation for the bombing campaign began. And then there were media reports about Serbia's troops gathering in the outskirts of Kosovo. Now they're entering Kosovo. Now they're killing Albanians in Pristina. Now they're killing Albanians in prison. These are all towns in Kosovo, cities in Kosovo. Oh, now they're killing Albanians in Peć. Now they're killing Albanians in Jelena, you name it. And on March 24th, 1999, NATO felt obliged to protect Albanians from this genocide and started a bombing campaign against Serbian, Yugoslav, let's say, but mainly Serbian military and police forces. I will say only this. One more thing that everyone can verify. After the war and after the overthrowing of Milosevic government in 2000, any number of Serbian civilian and military leaders were extradited to the Hague Tribunal, where they were tried for crimes, supposed crimes against humanity. Vast majority of them was sentenced, and they were found guilty. Now, here's the fact that anybody can check. In not a single one of those cases, not a single event that predates March 24, 1999 was even mentioned. Not a single event, not even the Račak incident. So even the Hague Tribunal, famously anti-Serb Hague Tribunal, couldn't produce, not only found, but they couldn't even produce the evidence that we did anything wrong before the NATO campaign. Yes. I guess that we probably did much less wrong even after the campaign began. But before the campaign, there was absolutely no reason to bomb us. And we were still bombed by 19 countries for 78 days. The bombing of Serbia was... It was really tough. I was in Belgrade, of course, and for the first few weeks, NATO actually did try to hit mostly military targets. But after that, when they realized that it had no effect, they started hitting civilian targets. We were without electricity, without water. Markets were bombed in daylight. Civilian trains were bombed. Buses. TV station was bombed. Chinese embassy was bombed. I mean, just imagine if, God forbid, Russia was to bomb a TV station nowadays in Ukraine. Just imagine that, God forbid, Russia bombs anyone's embassy in Kiev. That is what NATO did. They bombed the TV station. I mean, TV station is definitely not their biggest crime. They even bombed maternity hospital. But the most evident civilian target is a TV station because its program is you can see the program at any given moment,
Yeah.
So they bombed this TV station and killed 16 people there, and they bombed Chinese embassy.
And what about the use of uranium as well?
They used it heavily. Sadly, a year and a half after the bombing, there was a revolution of a sort in Serbia. Milosevic's government was overthrown. Not that Milosevic's government was ideal, don't get me wrong, maybe it was deserved to be removed from power, but sadly, the government that came after it was, I can't put it any other way, servile to the West. Humiliatingly servile to the West. And sadly, because of that, we never even conducted the proper research of the usage of depleted uranium, but it is well documented. It's not well documented, but from the documents that actually exist, that it's clear that maligned diseases like cancer exploded after the NATO bombing and whatnot. So yeah, they used depleted uranium. And they used it mostly against civilian targets because we Serbs maybe many things, but we know how to wage war, especially against many times mightier opponent. And I believe that in the end of the campaign, it turned out that NATO hit only 5 tanks, only 5 Serbian tanks, while Serbian troops managed to totally liberate the entire territory of Kosovo from the Kosovo Liberation Army. Kosovo Liberation Army was the name of the Albanian terrorist organization that fought for so-called independence from Serbia, but actually practiced terrorist actions against Serb police and military and civilian authorities. So while fighting with KLA fighters, KLA guerrilla on the ground, and all the time being bombed by NATO, Serbian troops managed to liberate the entire province of Kosovo, which is highland, so it's not really, especially in spring, it's not really the easiest terrain for such an action, but Serbian troops managed to do that. And along the way, only 5 tanks were destroyed. So, depleted uranium is mostly used against tanks, against armored vehicle, and they hit only 5 of them. Yeah. So if you see that they used 6 at depleted uranium missiles, at least one of them was used against civilians, against not military target, or missed its mark, and fell in the ground and contaminated the area or whatnot. And they definitely used much more than 6.
But you mentioned some minutes ago that the Albanians started to inhabit the Kosovo province back then. Presently, I believe there are 4 municipalities of Serbia majority citizens in Kosovo, and the other majority, the rest of other provinces, are inhabited by Albanians. When did did it start?
Not exactly. There are many. There are more. I think 12 12 municipalities in Kosovo that have Serb majority. Okay. But these 4 that you mentioned are focused on the northernmost part of Kosovo, and that is why they are a separate case. So sorry, go on with the question.
But the Albanians, how did they start to become a majority on that region? You said that people were fleeing. Were they fleeing Enver Hoxha, or was it previously?
Thanks for the question, because that's one of the details I forgot to mention. In 1945, you remember that There was a civil war in Yugoslavia. Not only that Yugoslavia was occupied by Nazis and fascists, but and we had two movements that fought against occupiers, but also fought against themselves, among themselves. So it was a chaos, you know. At the end of that chaos, in 1945, Josip Broz Tito is recognized by the West and mistakenly by Stalin as the leader of Yugoslavia, de facto leader of Yugoslavia. And one of his first orders of business was to forbid Serbian refugees from Kosovo to return to their homes. During the Nazi occupation of Kosovo, Yugoslavia and Kosovo, many Albanians collaborated with Italian fascists who were controlling the region, and they used that to, terrorize Serbs, to take their homes, their property, whatever. Many Serbs were threatened because of that. Their lives were threatened because of that, so they fled. After the war, they wanted to come back. In order to, I think I'm citing this word by word, to avoid confusion, Serbian refugees were not allowed to return to their homes after the war. That's one of the first steps they had no more important business than to forbid Serbian refugees to return to Kosovo. That was Josip Broz's policy toward Kosovo. Let's diminish as Serbs as much as we can, and let's expand Albania, increase Albanian population as much as we can. Yeah, and he was also accepting all the refugees, while Serb refugees weren't allowed to return to their homes. Albanian refugees from Enver Hoxha, from Albania, were generously allowed to come to Kosovo and to settle there.
Okay.
I mean, there are other crazy.
But for example, when
just
go ahead.
This speaks about the position of Serbia in Broz's Yugoslavia. Because of the so-called Soviet threat, after 48, Broz was afraid of Stalin's invasion of Yugoslavia, and because of that, they transferred 72 factories from Serbia to Croatia and Slovenia. Because if Soviets invade, Serbia is going to be conquered pretty easily because the invasion will come from that side. And in order to preserve our industry, before the Second World War, Serbia was actually the most developed. It was the most developed of all the areas of Yugoslavia. And after the war, Broz removed 72 factories to Croatia and Slovenia. I had no idea about that. When I was born, I've heard stories about that, but by my grandmother. As a kid, I was like, no, she must be talking nonsense, because how can you move a factory? I'm a kid. I have no idea that a factory can be moved. Yeah, they actually moved factories with helicopters, with buses, with trucks. They actually moved 72 factories
to save at least the economy during the invasion or whatever.
Yeah. The invasion that actually never came, was never planned, would never happen, But yeah, that was the position of Serbia. And then you hear stories that Yugoslavia was the expression of Serbian hegemonism. Really? I was almost expelled from school when I was 11 years old for writing a Serbian traditional centuries-old symbol of a cross with four. Never mind. It's usually like a letter C in Latin alphabet. It's actually not letter C. It's a fire poke. But never mind. Serbian historical sign for writing that in my notebook, my school book. I was almost expelled from the school. It was in 1985.
Yeah, right. It says a lot.
When people now speak about Broz as a gentle person, you would be punished if you had a public space that is without Broz picture.
No.
Of course, that law was declared after Tito died, actually, after he died, but nevertheless, it speaks of the nature of his regime. You have a classroom or a bar or a cafe or whatever, and you then don't have Broz picture in it. Oh man, come on, pay the price, or maybe you go to jail.
Yeah. But nearly 20 years later, at least 19 years after Tito or Broz was at least away from power in Yugoslavia, when we go back in time and we look at NATO intervention in Serbia, it is still hard for many to understand why Kosovo Liberation Army were seen first as terrorists by Western countries, and a few months later they just turned into freedom fighters. At the same time, some of this group's leadership presently are being tried at the not at the Hague, but at least in the Netherlands. I remember that the current United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who back then was the Portuguese Prime Minister, he supported NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia. It's public. It's you can have access to that content presently without any kind of doubt. How do you see that Portugal and the European Union's role on that intervention? Because I know it was NATO's, and it was supported, led, organized by United States. But how do you see Portugal and the European Union role on that intervention as well?
They participated in one of the nastier crimes of the 20th century. Again, TV stations were bombed, maternity hospitals were bombed, embassies were bombed, markets were bombed, public markets were bombed, streets were bombed for no other reason than American geopolitical interests.
Indeed.
Whoever served those interests and helped them do that and was involved with them in doing that is as guilty as they are. Simple as that.
And do you believe that Russia could have taken a different role back then? Not only before the United Nations Security Council, but also operationally speaking?
I don't think it's a coincidence that barely 6 months later, Vladimir Putin effectively became the president of Russia. Putin himself and many other Russians, many other Russian officials, and every single Russian I've spoken to in person said that the bombing of Serbia was a wake-up call for them. They all express how sorry they are for not helping us back then, but yes, that is what made them realize that West is never going to stop. America is never going to stop. You cannot reason with America unless you have a force they fear. That's it.
Well,
you cannot expect them to act rationally or peacefully or whatever. And barely 6 months later, something that we can call a silent coup happened in Moscow. You can think of Putin whatever you want. I mean, everybody, of course, can think of whatever they want, but one thing is certain. His rule is fundamentally different than Yeltsin's rule. I don't think it's a coincidence that such a change, even though Putin is very careful when he's speaking about Yeltsin, when he talks about that era, but every single Russian I've spoken to has nothing well to say about Yeltsin. Those years were disastrous for Russia too, not only for Serbia. And because of what happened to Serbia, they realized that the same fate awaits them unless they do something radically. Luckily, somebody in the Russian security or whatever services was reasonable enough to make some action. That's my interpretation. I'm still to hear or see anything that proves it wrong.
And even presently, if we take a look at Vladimir Putin's speeches, all of them, they all touch on the incident of NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia in
Yeah.
1999. So this was actually uh, a very important event that at least made him think that something needs to change in the world order. Otherwise,
Yeah.
Russia would likely be one of the next targets also to fall on the Western hands. But presently, do you see any kind of solution for the situation between Serbia and the Kosovo province? How can
Yeah.
this end?
Uh, if Americans go home, if Americans remove from there, Serbia would be more than able to offer something to Albanians in order for them to accept being part of Serbia again. I see that as a very realistic scenario, based on what I witnessed with my own eyes in my frequent visits to Kosovo province. First of all, my family originates from there. I still have relatives in the province, and I have many friends, and I frequently go there. Not as frequently as I would like, but I frequently go there. And I've spoken to a number of Albanians who say that, yeah, we wouldn't mind at all if Serbia was to come here again. I'm not saying that those Albanians are majority, but as time goes by, many of them actually see that Kosovo as a state is unsustainable. It can only become part of a bigger entity, either Albania or Serbia. I think it's very rational to choose Serbia.
Yes.
When you put it like that, not only because of that part of the world historically belonged to either Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, then Serbia, then Ottoman Empire, and then Serbia again. It was never ruled by Albania, which actually didn't exist before the early 19th century. So yeah, Serbia is one of the political, historical entities that actually proved capable of ruling over that region. In the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, that was one of the richest parts of Europe, maybe even the richest one.
Yeah.
I mean, back then, actually Germans were coming there to find work, not the other way around,
Yeah.
as it is today. So yeah, I mean, there are even nowadays there are German settlements in Kosovo. It was huge. Kosovo was famous for its mines, for its mining industry, and yeah, there are settlement. I mean, people who actually stay there and they remember their German origins from centuries ago. So I mean, if Serbia stops to surrender to the pressure by the West, we have no reason to accept any solution that is less than what I just described. We don't want to terrorize Albanians. We don't have to terrorize Albanians in order to fulfill our goals. Some Albanians will definitely have to answer for their crimes. I'm totally open for any Serb that committed crimes against Albanians to answer for those crimes. I think it's totally obvious that Serbia as a society is more than ready for that. Sadly, many Serbs answer for the crimes they didn't commit, or it's not proven that they committed. But if you can prove that I committed crimes against Albanians or whoever, make me pay for that, So yeah, whoever committed any crimes against humanity has to answer for them, which means a lot of KLA fighters or leaders,
Yeah.
like Ramush Haradinaj, like Hashim Tači, like many others. Albin Kurti, the current prime minister of so-called Kosovo, is one of the rare political leaders of Kosovo Albanians that actually didn't commit a single crime against Serbs. He was imprisoned. Back then, some people say that his imprisonment, many Serbs who are familiar with his case say that his imprisonment was too harsh, that he didn't deserve such a harsh treatment or a long sentence. So maybe we wronged him and not the other way around. But nevertheless, he is an extremist as a politician. He has right to be. Of course, it's his right, but I can't say anything other than that he is an extremist. And he is radical, maybe even dangerous radical, right now. He's really not contributing to the situation. But in another matter, Americans don't like him because they consider him a German asset. The same way they considered Klitschko a German asset when Maidan was happening. That is why Viktor Nuland infamously said that Klitschko should never be allowed into Ukrainian government. So Albin Kurti was positioned by Germans, was held by Germans, while Americans were dealing with Trump. So when they had their hands busy with Trump, the Germans did manage to create to fulfill some interests of their own. So not all Albanian leaders are war criminals, but nevertheless, Albin Kurti is an extremist. He's a radical.
Yeah, indeed.
But not a war criminal. So those who committed war crimes should answer for them, and those who didn't, not insignificant percentage of them would actually accept Serbia at once. The rest would probably be hesitant to rebel against Serbia. And in a year or two, they would see improvement. Because even though Serbia is in a somewhat sorry state itself, it is infinitely better shape than Kosovo. So Kosovo Albanians would see the improvement of their everyday life like immediately. Even nowadays, any number of Albanians actually go to Serb-dominated municipalities in the north of Kosovo to seek job opportunities, to work for pennies and dimes, but just to work. So they live in a very, very poor conditions. It's a totally dysfunctional. It's a failed state. It's not a state actually, but
yes,
it's a failed economy.
A kind of a proto-state, like we say in international law. It's a proto-state. It's a project of state, but not a sovereign state in de facto.
Yeah.
And for example, when some months ago it was made public a report that was endorsed by the European Commission, saying that in Serbia, one of the problems for the European Union to finally be able to make some influence in the society was the Orthodox Church of Serbia. It was made public, and Ursula von der Leyen also endorsed that report. How can you actually describe as what unites Serbs and Russians, and why Serbia is seen by the European Union as a renegade country along with Hungary? Although you have all those conditions, like you mentioned precisely, so you have way much better conditions as a state. You are a functioning state, always were. So why are you still seen as a renegade country?
By who?
By the European Union. By the European Union.
We are seen as a renegade country by renegade countries. We are seen as a renegade country by the only country in the world which used the nuclear weapon against other nation. So if they consider me a renegade, okay, I don't have a problem with that. I would be troubled if they liked me.
Yeah, indeed.
If we Serbs are seen as a renegade nation by a country that devastated Libya, Iraq, tried to destroy Syria, well, I have no problem with that. I would be troubled if they thought well of me.
And
Really?
what links do you think there exist between the Serbs and the Russians? Because every time you think of Serbs, okay, we see that there are some kind of bonds and heritage and links between Russians and Serbs, but it can't be only political or religious. There has to be way much more.
It's one of the mysteries of the world. I don't think that there is anything similar to the Serbian-Russian relationships. I mean, you have something sort of a brotherhood relationship with the Brazilians, but at least you share a language,
Yeah,
right?
right, indeed.
And you're practically neighbors. I mean, only the ocean, only the ocean divides you, you know. But there are a lot of relations between Serbs and Russians, and we don't actually speak the same language.
Yeah.
Somewhat similar, but also not very similar. We can't understand each other without a translator. A word here and there, but not entirely. There are many nations that are physically closer to Russians than Serbs. There are many nations that are physically closer to Serbs than Russians. And yet we simply adore each other. Any Russian I ever met abroad, I mean, we would instantly become friends. Any Russian who would visit Serbia is fascinated by the people, by the way he or she is welcomed, you know, and vice versa. Every single Serbian who ever came to Russia was totally delighted with the way he or she was accepted.
Yeah, so it's a mystery. You're saying it's a mystery. We don't have a
I-
formula.
If I were to explain the mystery, I would say, first of all, on a superficial level, it's like totally fascinating when you go thousands of miles away and you find a different nation, but nation with a very similar mentality that pretty much shares the same values you recognize as values. You know, like I guess that if I ever come to Portugal physically and not like this, you know, I would be fascinated with how different our cultures are. Everything would be interesting for me because of how different it is to
Indeed.
my mentality, my culture, my idea, my surroundings in Serbia, you know. But here is the other way around. You go to the other side of the continent practically and you find it extremely similar. People think, act, talk, feel the same way you do. That's on one level. On another level, I think it's, of course, that recognition, but but much deeper. You know, many times we Serbs and Russians too are led to believe or misled to believe that there is something wrong with us because we are so different from our neighbors. Maybe the neighbors are also different from each other, you know? But that's beside the point. We are different from all of them. So there must be something wrong with us. I guess it's possibly the when you reach a certain age as an individual, you start questioning yourself. I guess that's the same with nations, you know. All nations, historical nations like Serbs, do question themselves from time to time. Are we normal? Are we right? Do we make sense, you know? And then you encounter a similar nation, and it's a proof, it's a living proof that yes, you make sense. Yes, what you think, what you do, what you want, what you say actually makes sense. Because when it makes sense here in the Balkans, and it makes sense in the Caucasus, or in the far Russian East, or in Moscow, or in St. Petersburg, you know. So yeah, it must have some logic to it, you know.
Yeah, indeed.
We are living proofs to one another that actually there's nothing wrong with us. I think that is where a lot of Russophobia and Serbophobia come from.
Indeed.
Uh, that's uh, that's why they keep attacking Russia and why they keep attacking Serbia, because if we are left alone, there's a possibility that societies would create would be very decent, very pleasant, very humane, maybe in a different way than France would have been, or Portugal, or Brazil, or America, but it's decent nevertheless. Well worth living in, nevertheless.
You know that for us, for example, it's easier to create and develop bonds with other people, for example, with Serbia or Yugoslavia, because of football.
Oh yeah, of course.
Those are the great memories. For example, those Yugoslavia national teams, the Red Star Belgrade campaign. But when people need to know how the Serbians actually are, the same way I say everyone, you need to know, at least to try to contact and to get to know how the Russians are as a people, and then you see how different they are from all the prejudices that you have against the
Yeah.
Russians as a whole. So, and the same goes for the Serbians. It's not only a matter of sports. We need to have many other many other elements in order to help us understand and see that the Serbians actually are not that different, although they are different in some many other
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
If you allow me, that's possibly we as nations, both Russians and Serbs, are still fighting individualism. We are collectively fighting individualism. I think that individualism is the biggest lie ever. What is the lie? Not that individuals are worthy. No, they of course they have values. The lie is that before individualism as a movement or ideology, individuals weren't important, which is total lie.
Indeed.
Individuals were important in the Middle Ages, in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, not the same way. Sometimes they weren't important, but individuals are important in pretty much every. I mean, just think about this. We have no idea how Talibans make babies. Can you imagine a young Taliban man falling in love with young Taliban woman? They end up in a marriage and then produce kids. Can you imagine Talibans in that? No, you can't. Because we never think about Talibans that way. And yet, they're still doing it.
Yeah.
They are producing babies. They are producing families that produce babies. Chinese too. Taiwanians too. South Africans too.
Yeah.
Even though we're constantly bombed by the Hollywood propaganda or media propaganda, that we know that Americans are able to do that, and French people and German. Yeah, but so all the rest of the nations are.
We have all that in common, of course.
So they must value individual, since they are for centuries and centuries able to produce a husband and wife, a father and a mother, a child, a friend. I mean, Talibans probably have friends.
Yeah.
They probably gather at night or in the evening or talk about things that they find interesting or funny or whatnot. Yeah, maybe they don't have television or internet. Cubans too. Believe it or not, Cubans have fun. Cubans also produce babies. How? We have no idea. The only thing that we actually know about humans and babies is that prostitution is huge in Cuba. Even if it is, so what? They don't make babies. I mean, that's how detached from basic humanity we became. We have hard time imagining distant cultures doing the same things we do, even though we know that they have to do it.
Indeed. Indeed.
That's what individualism did to people. You know, I mean, just think about the West. If you want to be a recognized Westerner, you cannot disagree that America is the best country in history.
Oh, indeed. Indeed. Yeah.
It's not enough that you say America is a great country. No, it has to be the greatest country ever. It's not enough to say that America is a successful country. No, it has to be the most successful. It's not enough to say that America is a rich country. No, it has to be the richest ever.
That's
I mean, liberal ideologies in America and conservative ideologies pretty much agree on that. You cannot disagree on that with them. If you do, you are, as you said, a renegade,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, for sure.
So just imagine that. I mean, that's what you get when you trick people into thinking that each one of them is the center of the universe. Individualism is egoism on cocaine. Literally. You know, individualism is the way for anyone to just renounce personal responsibility. Because if you're responsible only for yourself, you're practically responsible to no one and nothing.
Indeed. Indeed. Indeed.
That is what the individualism did. It doesn't mean that in societies that don't follow individualism, that individuals are humiliated or disrespected or their rights are violated. No. I mean, one just have to go to Russia and see. If Serbia is at this point, sadly, maybe not the best example because of the constant turmoil and pressure that we are exposed to and everything, just go to Russia, just go to Moscow.
Yeah.
I dare anyone to find better organized, cleaner, and more beautiful city than Moscow.
Oh, and not only that, I always say to my audience that according to the United Nations Habitat ranking last year, actually Moscow was considered to be the metropolis or the big city with the best quality of life among other 28, which includes New York City, all those illusions that here in the West many people have that the best quality of life is in the United States of America, but Moscow is considered to be the biggest city in the world with the best quality of life. So, and with the best infrastructure at the same time.
No. I guarantee you, nobody in Serbia, nobody in Russia, nobody in Donbass, which is in effective state of war for 9 years almost. Nobody in Donbass lives as poorly, as badly as homeless people in America, which I've seen that firsthand when I was in America. I was in America twice, in 2016 and in 2020, and how those people live, nobody in Serbia lives like that.
That's
Even the poorest Serb have better living conditions than average poor American. So among poor Americans, you take the average among them, and he's living much worse than the poorest Serb. I guarantee that. And when you ask an American, average American will tell you that he's living in the greatest country ever. Not currently, but the greatest country ever. You know, now that's the thing that maybe even infuriates me, if I'm allowed to say that.
okay.
That kind of blindness has to be willing. You cannot be that blind just because somebody tricked you or you were exposed to some sort of. You have to admit. You have to willingly willingly participate in that kind of delusion. I mean, we're living in the age when every single truth is 3 or 4 clicks away. I have no idea what's going on in Portugal, for example. And before tonight, I didn't know a single Portuguese person that I could call and check what's going on there. So if something big, huge, worldly important happened in Portugal yesterday, even though I don't know a single word of Portuguese language, I could find out the truth, not what the media wants to tell me, but the truth in 3 clicks. Of course, because I'm a journalist, I know which sources I can trust. If I find a source that's on Portuguese or on a language I don't understand, I go to Google or Yandex Translate and voila. I will not understand. I will not have every word translated perfectly, but I will get the gist of it,
That's
So,
true. Yeah.
in this day and age, every single truth is 3 clicks away from you. And from anywhere in the world, if you want to find out what's actually going on in Ukraine, in Donbass, in Russia, you can find it in 3 clicks. And still, hundreds of millions of people in the West just don't want to do it. It's
By the
more
way,
convenient to them.
speaking of the Donbass, you've been dozens of times in the Donbass. When was your first time, and what kind of Donbass have you found in your first time, and what kind of Donbass can we find now?
I first came here in 2016, just for a day. I was, let's say, an observer for the local elections. Eventually, those elections weren't organized. They were only preparing for them just in case the the other side, the Ukraine, fulfills its Minsk agreement obligations, and they wanted to be prepared. So they were preparing everything for the elections. In order to do that, they invited observers from other countries. I was working at the time for a Russian media outlet, actually. So the invitation came through them. The editor knew that I was begging her to send me to Donbass ever since the war broke out in 2014. So she remembered that and she translated the invitation to me. I gladly accepted it, and I came here only for a day. It was Monday. I came to Donetsk early in the morning, and I left Donetsk late in the evening. In the meantime, I managed to persuade them that A, I am their new best friend. B, they are my new best friends. And C, they cannot go on without me. They have to invite me one more time, but not for a day, for a longer period of time. They gladly accepted. They invited me back. But why was I so fascinated with Donbass right away? Because of the comparison with Kosovo as a state. I immediately saw that this is a totally different case. You can never make a state out of Kosovo. And here, the moment you set your foot in Donbass, you see that it's a state. Not only a state, it's a society. You can artificially create a state or a country or name it, but you cannot artificially create a society. You cannot force people to take care of their environment. You cannot force people to not litter streets, to not, draw graffiti on walls. No, you cannot force people to do that. When people are taking that much care of their own city in the middle of the war, you have a functioning society. It's pity for Ukraine that Ukraine didn't know how to use that mentality. Donbass was part of Ukraine independent Ukraine from 1991 to 2014, just like Crimea was. Crimea was an autonomous region. Donbass was not. Actually, Donbass was Donetsk area and Lugansk area. Donetsk Oblast and Lugansk Oblast.
Yes.
There were 28 oblasts in Ukraine, I think. Donetsk and Lugansk were 2 of them. Crimea was also one of them, but with somewhat special status.
Yeah.
It was in autonomy. Because Crimea wanted to secede from Ukraine even back in 91. And guess what? Back in 91, majority of Ukrainians wanted to remain in the state union with Russia, actually in the Soviet Union. But their will was just violated, and Ukraine was declared an independent state. Some Ukrainians were enthusiastic about Ukraine as an independent state, as it is their right. The westernmost part of Ukraine, for example. Some other Ukrainians were much less enthusiastic. Actually, they were nostalgic about Soviet times, which is, again, their right. And on top of everything, they were proud members. They prided themselves to belong to the Russian culture in a broader sense of things, as it is their right. I mean, I can move to Portugal or Brazil or wherever tomorrow, but I will still be of Serbian heritage, and I will bring Serbian culture with me. And why would you deny me if I come to live right by you? Why would you deny me that?
From Lisbon, yeah.
These people didn't move anything. They were here the entire time. Actually, what's especially interesting for us Serbs, Serbian warriors were the first administrators of the Lugansk Oblast in 18th century. We rebelled against Turks. The rebellion was eventually crushed. The rebels fled to Austria-Hungary at first, but they didn't want to stay there. They specifically asked to move to Russia, to be allowed to move to Russia, because even back then, chances are not a single one of them ever met a single Russian. But even back then, they had the idea, Russia is our, let's say, another homeland, our other motherland. So they were restless. They created a huge political problem in Austria-Hungary. Like, we don't want to stay here. We want to go to Russia. And Austria-Hungary was like, but why? We need you here to protect our southern border. We don't care. You do with your border whatever you want. We want to go to Russia. Then when they actually reached Russia, Empress Yelisaveta made them the same offer. Can you protect our southern border? Of course we can. The same offer that they refused in Austria-Hungary, they actually welcomed it in Russia, and they were very effective in protecting Russians' pretty unstable southern border at the time. And because of that, Empress Yelisaveta awarded them with the keys of the Lugansk city, and they were the first administrators of the Lugansk Oblast, which was established only then and there. It was called Slaviano-Serbia. So even nowadays you have a small town near Lugansk, which is called Slaviano-Serbsk in honor of that title of the rich. So yeah. So anyway, they even had some part of the Serbian cultural heritage. That's what I wanted to say. But anyway, people in the eastern Ukraine were proudly Russian speakers. They were it's one of the most beautiful languages, one of the richest languages in the world. The language that created possibly, and for my taste too, the best literature ever. Dostoevsky, Gogol, Zamyatin, Tolstoy, not my personal favorite Tolstoy, but many people do like him, Bulgakov, Chekhov, you name it. It's a legion of great writers, great authors, Dostoevsky, possibly the most complex and possibly the best author ever. And why not be proud if you're part of that culture?
Yeah.
Why would you not want to be part of this culture if you're born in a house where Russian is spoken?
Indeed.
So yeah, they had every right, just like the western part of Ukraine had every right to feel that they are proud Ukrainians.
But have you been there in the western part besides the Donbass?
Never.
No.
Never, actually.
Kiev.
I was only in no.
Only in Donbass.
At this point, they would arrest me because I've been on Mirotvorets ever since
Of course.
2016. I was even warned by Serbian Secret Service that I should be careful because Ukrainian agents are following me, and maybe they will try to not actually harm me in a physical way, but tarnish my impeccable reputation or whatever.
Well, if you're on Mirotvorets, you must
I'm on
open.
Mirotvorets, yeah, definitely. I am one of the louder pro-Russian and pro-Donbas voices in Serbia because I felt that as my obligation, you know. When I had the opportunity to be one of the precious few Serbs to visit the area, I felt it my duty to report to the Serbian public about what I witnessed. I said I would always say it right away that yes, of course I'm heavily pro-Russian because I was brought that way. It would be dishonest of me to hide that fact, you know, but I will never lie. I will never hide the essential truth. Of course, I'm not going to reveal military secrets that I happen to find out,
Of
you know.
course.
It would be insane. So I'm not going to say, I can't say that I will never hide anything. Of course that any journalist ever would, he has to hide something.
But why does being a pro-Russian must be seen as at the same time being anti-Ukraine? Because you're not against Ukraine, you're not against Ukrainians. You just show and you just express a better connection with Russia and more empathy.
Well,
I mean,
I'm really not against Ukrainians, of course, but I am against Ukrainian military, Ukrainian army that bombed
of course, that's
Donetsk
different.
while I was living here for many months last year.
That's different. But you're not against the
Bombs,
citizens of Ukraine.
bombs are falling literally 100 or 200 meters away from me. When I was here in Donetsk in June last year, a maternity hospital was bombed literally 150 meters from the hotel I was staying in. Literally, you know. So yes, against them, against Ukrainian military, yes, I am.
But I think it's different, right?
As a person that's hopefully honest, you know, I would agree. I mean, it's not about my agreeing with it or not, but if it was up to me, of course I would investigate every single claim that war crime happened, regardless of how ridiculous it may sound. Yes, some of the war crimes are so ridiculous that at first glance they may appear unrealistic or not, that it's not true that happened. So if it was up to me, yes, I would investigate Bucha. I would investigate any of the Russian so-called crimes. But at this point, I'm much more prone to conclude that Bucha is as staged as anything.
Like the so-called mass graves of Izium.
When I was in Mariupol, I was among the first journalists to enter Mariupol. There was fighting still going on in March last year. I was one of the first journalists to enter Volnovakha when Volnovakha was the first big battle of this war. It's not a big town, but it was an important town on the way to Mariupol. And then battle for Mariupol exploded, and in mid-April, March last year, I was really one of the first journalists to enter Mariupol. And the people, we were escorted by Donetsk soldiers. At that time, it was still the army of the DPR, Donetsk People's Republic. We've seen Russian troops, but actually we didn't communicate them. We journalists were escorted to Mariupol by DPR troops. Believe me, Alexander, in not a single moment they even tried to influence our reporting. Not a single moment. They were helpful in a way that if I asked them, you see this building over there, who shelled it, They would say, oh, it's probably Ukrainians. That one, it's probably Ukrainians. That one, sure, it was probably our side. Literally, they would say things like that. Mm-hmm. They, of course, they were protecting us. They were very careful about our security. Don't go over there. It's too near the front lines. Don't go over there. There could be mines. Don't go over there. There could be Ukrainian snipers. That way, yeah, of course, because they were responsible for us. But in no moment they tried to influence. I actually filmed people in Mariupol who were blaming Russia for everything. They were evidently minority. The vast majority of Mariupol citizens blamed Ukrainians, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian army, Ukrainian military, Ukrainian Secret Service, Azov battalion. I never met a person in Mariupol who would speak nicely about Azov battalion until actually I interviewed a former member of the Azov battalion who is now in Russian captivity. But I was actually allowed to speak with him with no interference whatsoever by his Russian captors. He was saying to me and to RT reporter, two of us were in that tour, he was saying nice things about Azov. He said that when I asked him, would you do everything again? Of course I would. I'm proud of my time with Azov. I never related, you can ask Russian soldiers I captured. I never violated any of their rights in any point. He was talking like that. And nobody ever said to me, please don't put that in your report. No. Nobody ever influenced me in any way. No, not a single Russian soldier or authority figure or whoever. Never. Only in a matter of, in matters of my security. That's it. And I'm speaking for other journalists that were working alongside me in those days and in this area, in Donetsk and Lugansk area. Yeah. Never, ever we were censored or whatnot. And people keep mentioning Russian propaganda. Really? I mean, of course that any country that's involved in the war is going to have the official line. And that officials of that country are expected to follow the official line. Of course. If that's what you mean by Russian propaganda, yeah, Russians have propaganda. Of course that state-owned TV stations or media, we are going to be more enthusiastic about promoting that official line. If that's Russian propaganda, okay, yeah, there is, but it's nothing bad or nothing illogical.
No, it actually worries us a lot here in the European Union because we can see there's a clear narrative that has to be sold, that must be delivered to the citizens, and they don't even try to pretend that this is natural. The mass media here and the political power, they just deliver a message perfectly biased. And there's no mistake about that. So that's what worries us a lot, much, because we don't know. There's no solution rather than have access to alternative media bodies. For example, not only my channel, but there are several channels and journalists like you. That's the only way for us to have access to the truth. Because here there's a clear narrative that must be sold against Russia on everything, even some dumb situations. They try to play with every kind of domain of life in society. Not only regarding the war, the conflict, not only politics, not only economy, but also, for example, things as, for example, a couple of weeks ago, one of the news that was being sold here in order to sell a negative image of the Russians was that the Russians were training dogs in order to attack the Ukrainians. So street dogs. So you see, they go to every point of the life in society in order to brainwash people here. And it worries us a lot.
Well, I think it's an Irish proverb, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, You can't brainwash people who aren't prone to brainwashing, I can only refer to Dostoevsky, his famous The Grand Inquisitor. chapter from the Brothers Karamazov. It describes perfectly that kind of mentality, you know. And I mean, he wrote it 150 years ago, almost 150 years ago, and he actually, it's as if he could see the modern mentality, you know, the people who actually choose to go through life ignorant.
Just like, for example, the view and the image of the Ukrainians as far right and neo-Nazi apologists. For example, from your presence on the ground and from what you know, not only from Ukraine but also from the Donbass, do you think that this is, like they say here in the West, Putin's propaganda, or do you actually see that there is some kind of sense of neo-Nazi ideologies spread by a part of the population?
It is definitely not Russian propaganda. Now, when Russians say, or when I say that Ukraine is dipped in Nazism, that it's under neo-Nazi ideology, it doesn't mean that every single Ukrainian is a neo-Nazi. Of course not. First of all, Ukraine. I've never been there, but from what I've seen from people who live here in Donbass, who I talk to, and of course they traveled throughout Ukraine before the war. From what they've been telling me, Ukraine was a pretty diverse society in the country, and you had all kinds of people and ideologies there. Even Darth Vader was like participating in an election.
Indeed, yes, candidate,
Few
yes,
years ago.
presidential election, yeah.
Yeah. When people say, rightly so, that there is strong Nazi presence in Ukraine, that they mean that there is actually no functioning opposition to the Nazism in Ukraine, either Nazism as an ideology or neo-Nazism as a movement. Maybe even majority of Ukrainians are against Nazism, but they do nothing about it. Which means that the minority that is actually pro-Nazi or neo-Nazi can do whatever the hell they want, because nobody's going to stop them. I don't know if it's a minority anymore, because if you ask me, the very essence of Nazism, not fascism, but Nazism, is Russophobia. Slavophobia, actually, but Russophobia. Because, I mean, if you take a look at Hitler and who helped him come to power, who financed him all the way until 1939, and what was his purpose that he eventually delivered, but not in 1939 as they expected, but in 1941, i.e. to attack Russia or Soviet Union. Yeah, there's a pretty strong case to make that the very essence of Nazism is hatred toward Russians or Slavs, because we Serbs also suffered greatly from Nazis and Nazi collaborators. So in that way, pretty much every Ukrainian who hates Russian nowadays can be considered a Nazi. One can say that it is Ukrainians' right to hate Russians now because Russians are destroying their country. In a way, Russians are destroying their country, but let's put everything in context. Yes, destroying of a country is a terrible thing. But Japan was destroyed too in 1945. Much more viciously than Ukraine today, by Curtis LeMay and, of course, by Fat Boy and what's the name of the other nuclear bomb? Yeah, Fat Boy was one, and Funny Boy was the
No,
one.
Fat Boy.
Fat Boy was one, and what was the name of the? I mean, they even had a name for nuclear bombs.
It was the Fat Boy, and the other one. Let me see if I can remember.
Never
But
mind.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
So Germany was destroyed at the end of the World War, or when in the final stages of the World War II. So sometimes it's maybe not the only solution, but one of the only solutions. history will have to determine where Russians right or wrong to conduct a military operation against Ukraine. Me, being a Serb, I think that by doing that, they spared themselves by a genocide or three. If we Serbs did something similar to the Russian special operation back in 1930s, of course it would be inside a single country, Yugoslavia, Kingdom of Yugoslavia again. It wouldn't be anything like this, except that it would be a preventive war in a way. I mean, this here is not just a preventive war, because the war was going on for almost full 8 years before Russia officially joined in. The first night I slept here in 2016, I could hear artillery. In Serbia, we say this is the sign that I'm speaking the truth when I sneeze. Sorry.
Yeah.
My second night, guys who I just met took me to one of the hills here in Donbass to show me the artillery fire over the city. It was, I mean, officially it was the truce, but there was nothing like the truce. In 2016, my friend, who was a volunteer in the Donetsk army at the time, he witnessed in Debaltsevo. Debaltsevo was possibly the biggest battle in the war before Russian military operation. He was in the Battle of Debaltsevo, and he saw Ukrainian planes delivering leaflets over the city. Leaflets were saying, "We need land, we don't need people. Get out." I mean, to go back to a question about Nazi ideology, if that's not Nazi or just like Nazi, what is?
Yeah.
There are reports of horrific crimes committed by Ukrainian troops long before Russian military operation. So, again, it doesn't mean that everything is true just because I heard it. I have my reason to actually believe those sources, those people I interviewed. But if somebody doesn't believe them, okay, go on, investigate. Just don't tell me to shut up only because you can't even imagine yourself saying anything that goes against the official American line created in Washington. Please.
Indeed.
If you can't even imagine saying anything that Victoria Nuland would disprove, then please don't tell me to shut up. I mean, I won't shut up either way. You're just gonna save yourself a lot of energy by not telling me to shut up.
So
or trying to cancel me.
I have two last questions before we end.
Sorry,
First,
I'm talking to
No,
Sorry
no.
if I bored your audience to death. Which
no,
is
absolutely
always a
not. And
possibility.
do you want an evidence that people liked and enjoyed this so far? We had over 1,000 viewers here listening to you. So,
Big hello to all of them.
and several others will also join after I add the subtitles. So, as you can see, they are enjoying your assessment on all these issues. But
Don't ever tell me that you're gonna have a hard time finishing this conversation.
it's almost
You see that I'm not the one to mince words. Yeah.
it's almost 3 a.m. there. But what do you think people should know? Something that everyone should know, not only about the Donbass, but also about Ukraine itself.
Well, I think it would be wrong of me to speak about Ukraine itself. I mean, as I said, from my impression, pre-war Ukraine was a very diverse country. So I can only speak about things that I saw in areas that were liberated or conquered, any way you want to take it, by Russian and Donbas troops. So it's not really enough to make any conclusion about Ukraine. Of course, I have my opinion about ideology about Ukrainian society. But what I want people to know about Donbas is that they are only exercising there was no separatist movement in Donbas prior to Maidan. There was no war prior to Maidan. Not even Maidan itself, even though it was really serious, gravely serious political turmoil organized by Americans. Even that wouldn't necessarily result in the war. The war became inevitable on the May 2nd, 2014, when at least 48 and possibly double that number of people were burned alive in Odessa. You cannot burn Russian people alive, practically on Russian borders, and expect to not face any punishment for that.
Yeah. To move on like if nothing happened yet.
Yeah. After that, I don't think there was ever a chance for any peaceful resolution to the Donbas problem. Crimea was a special case because Ukrainians were always hesitant to move against Crimea. They knew that Russians, because of their earlier military presence there, according to the official agreement between Russia and Ukraine, that Russian troops are well organized there, well positioned, and yeah. But Donbas was another matter. Donbas was something that no one expected, not even Russia. But when Donbas people saw what happened to Crimea, that Crimea was instantly rejoined with Russia, they were like, we want the same thing. They didn't want 9 years of war and misery, no. Who would want that?
Of course.
But they actually wanted to become part of Russia, just like Crimea did prior to that.
Indeed.
And for that, literally all of them voted. I mean, the vast majority of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast voted, even folks in Mariupol, folks in Volnovakha, folks in Bakhmut. I think don't take my word for it, but either Mariupol or Bakhmut is where the highest percentage of the pro-Russia's vote was recorded in the referendum in May of 2014. Either Mariupol or Bakhmut. I think Mariupol actually, not Bakhmut, but maybe it's even Bakhmut.
I must check that information. That's quite interesting, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, they actually voted. I think this was like, 85 or 90% voted for secession from Ukraine and rejoining Russia. And why did they even organize a referendum? Because of the illegal coup in Kiev, a coup named Maidan, and even more so because of the crime in Odessa.
Yeah.
You cannot organize the coup, a violent pro-Nazi coup in a country neighboring Russia that was historically part of Russia for centuries, and then on top of everything, you start murdering Russians, burning them alive. You cannot do that and expect nothing to happen.
Indeed.
Maybe Russia's reaction was long overdue, maybe it was late, but if you think about what I've just said, it's more than deserved. It doesn't mean that everything that Russia did or that I wrote or published or said is brilliant or ideal or whatnot. Feel free to judge me the same way I want everyone to be judged, by their deeds, by their actions, but just prove me wrong. Prove Russian troops wrong. Don't believe propaganda, don't believe lies, don't believe baseless fabrications like Bucha. Something happened in Bucha. Somebody was killed in Bucha.
Yeah.
But maybe not as many people as they claim. And maybe those murdered aren't actually Ukrainian freedom fighters, but maybe pro-Russian activists who were killed after Russia's withdrawal. Maybe Russia didn't suffer a humiliating defeat in Kiev. Maybe Russians actually aren't imbeciles who wanted to capture Kiev with 3 columns of tanks. No, maybe they actually wanted to trick Ukrainian army into doing exactly what the Ukrainian army ended up doing, protecting Kiev, and because of that, unable to help Donbas troops and Zaporozhye troops and Kherson troops. Maybe Russians actually do know something about war. Maybe this operation of theirs is not really a disaster because they started the operation with 3 times fewer soldiers than Ukrainians. And they were attacking. No, that's the first, maybe even unprecedented event in history that 3 times less numbered army is attacking the opponent who has three times more troops than the attacker. And on top of everything, with that, they managed to conquer or liberate the entire Lugansk area, big chunk of Donbas area, Donbas Republic, huge chunk of Kherson area, and huge chunk of Zaporozhye area. And to create havoc amongst Ukrainian army, to threaten Kiev, to force Ukrainians to protect Kiev with troops that would otherwise serve them much better in other parts of the front lines, to threaten Kharkov, to keep Kharkov under siege. They managed to do that in first 5-6 months of the operation with 3 times with force that was that they had 3 times fewer troops than Ukrainians. And you keep hearing that Russian military campaign is a disaster. Really? I mean, of course there were problems. Russians are the first to admit that there were problems here and there and wherever. But that it's a disaster. It's ridiculous. And I guarantee 95% of the Western audience, not of your show, but of the Western public, actually believe that Russians suffered humiliation after humiliation in the Ukrainian campaign.
That's right. That's what we hear here very
It's
often.
ridiculous. I mean, just remember that when Azov battalion surrendered, the reports in the Western media were like, they are evacuating. Do you know about that? They reported that Azov battalion is evacuated. Yes, they are evacuated to Russian prison. That's how that's what surrendering is. Evacuation from your position to the prison. If that's the evacuation, then they were evacuated. So it's lie after lie after lie. And you know what? One of the biggest lies ever, actually, is that Western societies are functional democracy, ruled by free thinking, while Russia and possibly China and other Eastern societies are some tyrannies that are, underdeveloped and where there is no free thought. It's quite the contrary. There is nothing so stupid in Russia as there is the idea that exists in America, that America is the greatest country ever. First, the very idea that you can actually measure which country is greatest ever. I mean, greater than Byzantine Empire, greater than Roman Empire, greater than what? Than Egypt?
They want to recreate that.
How can you measure that even? But not only do they believe that, they will they will be angry at you if you don't agree with them.
That's
So
true.
you have almost like a consensus in the American society on that.
It is.
Consensus between conservative pundits and liberal commentators,
So,
There is nothing so stupid in Russian society that everybody agrees on. I don't know if there's a single thing that the entire Russian society agrees on. But whatever that is definitely not as stupid. I mean,
no, it hasn't.
there is
Yeah.
nothing. I don't think I ever read or heard anything so stupid in Russian internet or television or anything as the idea that there is a country that's better than any other country that's ever existed, and that best country ever is America. I mean, it's so ridiculously absurd that it's almost unfathomable. It would be unfathomable if not for the fact that they keep repeating it, they keep parroting it every single day. But and people think that society that actually believes, or a significant part of the society believes that they are the greatest country ever, they think that the other country, which has nothing even remotely as stupid in their public sphere, they are the ones who are backwards. I mean, in Russia, they challenge everything. Discussions in Russian portals, in Russian Telegram channels, in Russian YouTube channels. I mean, they are mostly banned from YouTube now. But such lively discussions. They argue over everything, but they argue like adults, not in a way that they want to cancel each other.
No.
They're not insulted if you don't agree with them.
Yes.
They don't feel. They're not triggered if you express an opposite opinion. No, they will challenge your opinion and they will allow you to challenge their opinion, but they will not be triggered. Two things that you practically cannot find in any Russian society, be it pre-war Russia or be it Donbass, are hysteria. I mean, I literally have a hard time thinking about any single Russian ever that I saw hysterical. I mean, I saw people whose apartments were bombed minutes ago, whose car was bombed, who escaped death minutes ago. And they are sad, disappointed, maybe scared, but they aren't hysterical. He's not yelling, he's not losing his mind. So there is no hysteria. And number two, there is no manipulation of cheap emotions. No. I never would. I mean, I don't speak brilliant Russian. I can understand them pretty much everything what they're talking right now. On the street, in the restaurants, in hotels, on the front line, on television. And I tell you, I don't think I ever saw the manipulation of cheap emotions in the Russian public. I saw both hysteria and cheap manipulation in Russian movies, in Russian TV shows. I don't know why. And they all keep watching that. And they are still not hysterical. Never. It's amazing, really amazing, actually. And they are the first one to say, "Oh, we're not perfect." If you just do this as an experiment, start praising Russia in front of a Russian. Even the strongest patriot of Russia will tell you, "Well, you know what? We are not a perfect country." He will always don't go too far. We're not imbeciles. We know that something has to be wrong with this part of this area, and do the opposite. Start praising France to French people. Start praising Britain to English patriots. Start praising America to Americans. You will see no complaint of them. So yeah, I rest my case.
No, it was actually a great thought to share with us, with all of us. But the last question is, what projects do you have for the future?
I'm actually finishing a documentary about the special military operation. Now I'm tempted to call it Brothers in Arms. No, I won't. I will leave Dire Straits to their own chickens. Yeah, but I was one of the really very few foreign journalists here. I came in Donetsk, in Lugansk and then Donetsk, 12 days before the special military operation, on February 12th last year. So, I mean, I was surprised as anyone when the operation began, but I was here many times before, in earlier years, and I was here before the operation. I spent more than 5 months in Donbass last year, and I'm here again. I practically have everything that I wanted to film. I just need some kind of closure. No, I don't think that I will wait for the end of the war, because that may take a while. But I need some kind of closure to make it like a project that will hopefully be interesting even 10 years from now or 50 years from now. So yeah, that's the main one. The other one is project, if you can call it like that, is to report from here to the Serbian public. After all, this is the 4th time my viewers actually paid for my trip here. I'm certain that the first successful crowdfunding event in Serbian media ever was my trip to Donbass in February last year. I asked the viewers, I said, we are just a small independent YouTube channel. We have no money for that trip, but because I was there many times in earlier years, I know how to cut corners. I know how to make a trip that would otherwise cost, I don't know, 3,000 euros. I can make it in 1,500, you know? So actually, yeah, the viewers responded. It was one of the proudest moments of my career. I mean, definitely.
I believe so.
When I saw so many people who wanted to help, and they contributed once more when I wanted to stay, because originally I came for 2 weeks, but then 2 weeks turned into 2 months because the operation started. So they sent the money for me to stay longer. Then they sent the money for me again to come in May and June, along with 2 colleagues. So they paid the trip for 3 of us. And this is actually the 4th time that they are giving us money for this specific purpose, because Serbs, we sympathize with Russia, we love Russia, and we want to know what's going on in the war that Russia is so heavily involved. And B, we know that it is in our interest that those who harmed us heavily and dearly in the last 30 years don't end up victorious here. From what I can witness, let's say this for the end.
Yeah.
I've been here for 4 days, and only like a handful of examples of Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk, I know of. Everything else is Russian artillery. I mean, we hear artillery throughout the day, but 99.9% of that is Russian artillery firing on Ukrainian positions around Donetsk. And for the first time ever in a year, it was almost exactly a year after the infamous Tochka U attack on the center of Donetsk. For the first time in almost a year, at least the center of Donetsk feels protected.
Oh.
There were few Ukrainian attacks on the outskirts of Donetsk, Petrovsky Rayon, mostly in Kubishevsky Rayon, but downtown Donetsk is, for the first time after a year, protected, or if you want, for the first time after almost 9 years. So yeah, I mean, that speaks something about who has the initiative. I mean, we literally hear artillery. If I were to remove my headphones right now and switch to microphone, perhaps you would hear it too. I would have to open the window, of course, but you would probably hear it too. If we were speaking without this, you would probably hear artillery fire, and that speaks a lot about anti-Russian propaganda, because for months and months, and especially in the last few weeks, the Western media have been persuading us that Russians are almost totally out of munition, right?
No, of course.
And that they have no strength whatsoever for any offensive.
And now that they're fighting with shovels.
And well, something pretty similar to offensive is already on its way. Long ago, it was on its way. And it's not so offensive in a classic sense, but they are pushing Ukrainians on a very wide front line. So they're pushing them slowly, step by step, but on a very wide front line. Bakhmut is definitely the most interesting now for the world public, because a lot of the fighting was going on there. But I still think that the most important spot in the entire front line in this war, in this conflict, is Donetsk. For some reason, Ukrainians are irritated by Donetsk even more than by Lugansk. Practically because Donetsk was the industrial capital of the Ukraine before the war. And, because of that, they cannot let Donetsk live peacefully. And if Russia manages to protect Donetsk, it will be a victory. It will be, I think, a total defeat of Ukrainians that even they will not be able not to admit. If Donetsk is protected, I'm pretty certain that Ukrainians lose any reason for a war. I think that's why I think that everyone who keeps repeating that Bakhmut is insignificant is wrong. Perhaps it could be insignificant strategically or in a strict military sense, But if Bakhmut falls to Russian hands, there is a possibility that the Ukrainian troops that are around Donetsk and around Gorlovka will have to abandon their positions in order to avoid being encircled by Russians. And if they abandon their positions here, then Donetsk will be protected. They won't be able to bomb, to shell Donetsk on a daily basis as they've been doing for the past year or for the past 9 years. At that point, I'm pretty certain that they lose the reason for war. And that's why Zelensky government is so determined to try to hold to Bakhmut until the last Ukrainian, literally. That's why they've been losing so much. As far as I know, every single Ukrainian troop who was in Bakhmut in late summer last year, when the battle for Bakhmut began, is now either dead or captured or wounded to the point of never returning to the front line. So what Russians are fighting now in Bakhmut is totally different Ukrainian army than the one they encountered at the beginning of the battle. So yeah, that's it. I mean, a lot of propaganda. I mean, just when people say Russians were foolish enough to expect that they will crush Ukraine in a matter of days, Oh, really? And that is why they kept Wagner force until July?
Yeah.
Really? Oh, yeah. Brilliant conclusion. Just please explain to me why did they kept Wagner force, Wagner forces troops until July? By the way, they were on high alert ever since the beginning of the operation. Wagner troops. I know that. I know Wagner troops. Some of them I know personally. They were on high alert and they were waiting for it. So it's not like that Russians remembered Wagner only in July. No. They had Wagner in their minds from the beginning, but they knew that they're going to use them later on. Here's another fact, proven fact. Sorry if I'm taking too long. Please tell me
No, no,
if
no,
you
no,
if
no,
you have
no. Feel free.
that proves how distrustful the anti-Russian propaganda is. They keep telling that Russians expecting that Ukrainian people will greet them with flowers. No. In every single town or city or oblast that the Russians took, they brought Donbas people with themselves who would help organize the city under the new regime, under the new, system, because they actually knew that Donbas people are the only ones who can they trust with that kind of tasks. They knew that if they let local people do that, they will only get the same thing as what was there before, a corrupt state, a barely functioning state, you know?
Indeed.
So they actually know who they were dealing with. I mean, they knew that vast majority of Ukrainians in the territories that are now considered Russian or disputed actually don't really care which country they belong to. I've been to Melitopol and I can tell you, they don't actually care. I believe that they voted massively for Russia because they see Russian administration in their city, Russian flags. That's it. Nobody's forcing them to vote that way. But they know that right now they belong to Russia, and then they will vote Russia. But if, God forbid, Ukrainians were to come to rule the city once again, they would be and organize the referendum. Those same people will probably vote. I'm not saying anything wrong to that. That's their mentality. That's their right.
Yeah.
They possibly have very strong social will, economical will, individual will, but their political will is practically non-existent. It was typical for Ukraine before the war, as people keep telling me, and actually I saw that with my own eyes, and that is why Russians brought Donbas people with them who would help them organize this city or that area. So no, they weren't expecting Ukrainians to greet them with flowers. It's one more stupid propaganda, probably created in London, because for some reason British have a penchant for stupid propaganda. I mean,
No,
I don't
that's
know
a part of
what
a
it is.
bunch of lies that actually have been being said since the last year. Not only that, because I never met anyone from Russia that actually believed that Ukrainians were going to be there waiting for the Russian troops with flowers. No one ever said that, and no one ever emphasized or suggested that this could be true or believed by Moscow authorities. So it's just one of the hundreds of lies that actually are being said, like that the Russians wanted to capture Kiev in 3 days. They never said that. Never, 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 never.
Of course.
So, but
No,
to,
it doesn't mean that everything went according to Russian plan.
of
Of
course,
course,
it's
because
different.
if everything went according to Russian plan, this war would be over long ago. It's still going on, so no, Russia failed to fulfill some of its goals, or maybe majority of its goals. But Russia is on a way to fulfill all of them, whichever goals they may be. I mean, they keep repeating Putin's words about demilitarization and denazification, but You know what? Is Russia obliged to reveal its goals to their enemies?
Of course not.
I
That's
mean, they
nonsense.
said demilitarization and denazification because, in a way, yeah, those are reasonable goals.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean? Well, that's only for Russians to decide. If they manage to protect Donbas and keep Zaporozhye and Kherson Oblast, and Crimea, of course, I mean, nobody's ever even doubting Crimea at all. If they manage to protect Donbas, the entire Donbas, so to take control of the rest of the Donetsk area, and Lugansk, of course, and Zaporozhye and Kherson, it will be a success depending on the cost. If Russian army did suffer as many losses as Western media and analysts keep claiming, then it will be too costly. Even as a success, it will be too costly. But I have some other information, and I'm pretty certain that Russian casualties are many times fewer than what's reported in the West. It doesn't mean, Dmitry Peskov was the first to say that Russian losses are significant. He said it even in the first weeks of the operation. He was criticized heavily for that statement in Russia itself. As I say, I keep telling people, Tony Blinken is never facing criticism that any of the government officials in Russia are facing on a daily basis. A vast majority of Americans have no idea even what Blinken is doing or don't care. Well, there, every single line, just because he said, it's at the very least, it's a humane statement in a way that, for me as Dmitry Peskov, every single Russian loss, every single Russian life is significant loss. You know? That could be very well his explanation. But even still, he was heavily criticized for that.
Indeed.
So, in the beginning of the war, Russian official of the highest order, Dmitry Peskov, said that Russian losses are significant. So Russians actually make no excuse for some of their failures or whatever. They are very realistic about their analysis and their prognosis. But even still, I actually, based on my Russian sources, I'm totally confident that the Russian casualties are many times fewer than what's been reported in the West.
Indeed.
Maybe the number is bigger than Russians expected, but it's definitely many times fewer than what's reported.
It's not impossible, but it's actually very hard to measure and to reach the real numbers. Even if there was will from the Russian side to show the real numbers, I believe that it's almost impossible to give the right image. And like one of our viewers is saying presently, Mr. Luis Pacheco, he says that he highlights something that actually is true. Putin said that he would take this military intervention that would take as much time as they need in order to achieve their goals. And I usually remember here one Russian saying, "Война покажет план," so which means
Yeah.
that they don't have any kind of problem with that if that's the necessary in order to reach the goal. And here in the West, it's very hard. You can't believe how hard it is for people to understand this way of view events on the ground. But we do our part. Dear Miodrag, it's it passes already 3 a.m., but I must say that it was actually a real pleasure if it was by me, and also for our viewers. You actually have one person here called Stara Serbia cheering you a lot, saying very good things about you, also in Serbian, I believe, at least that's what's written here. So
Well,
you have a lot of
big hello
viewers.
to Stara Serbia then. Stara Serbia means old ancient Serbia, and by the nickname itself,
Oh, it's like in Russian, the study old.
Yep.
And you have viewers from Mozambique, Angola, Brazil, Portugal, of course. A lot of people very interested, and since from the early beginning, following everything that you were saying, they were also developing
Big
their debate.
hello to Mozambique people. Let me please tell them that every time I played Civilization 4, I protected them from foreign invaders. So Mozambique all the way. Yeah.
So everybody's cheering you, everybody's saying a lot of things to you, many questions as well. But in the end, we all loved this, and soon I will add the subtitles not only in English but in Portuguese and at the same time in Russian. So this way, a lot of other viewers can have access to it. So from now, I just want to suggest people to follow you, not only on Telegram, not only on Twitter. I already added your links, your accounts here to the description of the video. And also on YouTube, we can follow Miodrag Zarkovic. And thank you very much once again for being here.
And in Dire Straits, of course. I mean, when they
one day you'll use this for the soundtrack of one of your documentaries. So thank you very much once again. Please don't.
Thanks for the invitation, and really thanks for the patience for talking with me for 3 hours almost, and people who listen to me, thank you. I mean, I hope I wasn't.
So see you guys in one of our next live shows in the future, in the near future. And once again, please don't hang up, and I will just end the stream here. So I wish everyone good evening. Miodrag wishes the same, at least he already did it. And
yes.
Thanks everyone for following and for being here for around 3 hours. It was quite interesting, quite insightful. So thank you very much. Good evening.
Thanks a lot again.
So